Right, welcome everybody. We're super privileged to be here with Dr. Kim Nicholas, who's a professor at Lund University in Sweden, who's come to talk to us today about agricultural systems in the European Union and in Sweden. And so let's get right to it. So Kim, I wonder if you could just tell the students a bit about your background and your research.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Nathan. It's really fun to get to chat and nice to meet your students virtually. So I did my PhD at Stanford. I finished in 2009, and then I got this job here in 2010. So I've been in Sweden now for more than a decade. So I did 3 interdisciplinary degrees and one disciplinary one, which was in viticulture and enology, so wine growing and winemaking. So in a parallel universe, I would be a wine grower or a consultant to the wine industry, potentially in California. But instead, I ended up being a professor here in Sweden. That's because my PhD was about the effects of climate change on wine growing in my hometown of Sonoma, north of San Francisco. So both from agronomy and biophysical angle, looking at how light and temperature affects the composition of grapes and the phenology and growing of grapevines, and how growers adapt to and view climate change. And before that, I mean, our connection goes back in the day. I did my master's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in John Foley's lab, and there I was studying carbon cycling in a restored prairie and the potential for basically what now is called nature-based solutions to take up carbon.
Nice. Yeah, you're ahead of the time when it comes to nature-based solutions.
Well, actually, I was like, oh, the potential for this is not really that good. I think I'm going to do something else. So
yeah,
that was my conclusion in 2003.
you were
Again,
early
ahead of
on
my time.
Yeah, that's right, way ahead of the time, including the disenchantment with it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, now that you've been in Sweden for 10 years and experienced kind of the local systems and the broader EU context, if you could tell us a little bit your observations about how agricultural systems in the EU differ from those in the US.
Sure. Let's see. I know you asked for differences. There are many similarities. One is homogenization and consolidation. I mean, that's a pretty global trend, I think. I think we'll talk more about the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, which is an EU policy that goes back to 1962. So it's been around a long time under different forms. And that is really important to understand what drives agriculture in Europe, because that's about something like 60 billion euros per year. So that's the biggest item in the European Union budget. It's about 40% of public money that goes to the European Union goes to the farm policy, basically. So very politically powerful. I think I haven't made a research comparison, but my impression is that I think the power of the farm lobby is even bigger in Europe than it is in the US. But I think there's also a similar dynamic in that 80% of that CAP money goes to 20% of growers. And so those tend to be agribusiness, big companies, and large farms if they're private. So that's, again, a similar dynamic where I think it's hard for small and medium farmers to compete, and sometimes the incentives are not in the right direction in terms of healthy and sustainable food production.
Yeah, really interesting. And what about also the mix of like types of cropping systems? I guess similar, we have kind of like the California to Corn Belt sort of mix. And I guess in the EU, it's really maybe pretty prominent north to south, from Mediterranean growing systems up to, I guess, cereals and tubers and things like that up and canola, things like that in Sweden. Is that fair characterization?
Very good. You get an A. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the Mediterranean is the southern part of Europe, and so those kind of Mediterranean crops like vineyards, wine growing, orchards, Spain in particular is really big in fruit and vegetable production. So Spain is kind of the California of Europe, if you think like that, in
Yeah.
terms of the majority of the fruits and vegetables within the EU. We also have a big import of indirect import. I mean, David Zaks, among others, has shown, there's a lot of the meat that is in animal products that are imported into Europe are sort of an import of virtual water and grain and land from other places because they're so resource intensive. And so even for animals that are raised in Europe, if they're fed grain, that's often imported, at least to
Yeah,
some extent, and especially soy, and that has a big footprint.
absolutely. So kind of like the diets are maybe richer than the land base can sustain, and so it has to kind of like import land, if you will, through importing animal feed.
That, exactly, yeah.
Yeah,
There's some work happening by colleagues in Sweden to look at, okay, what would a healthy and sustainable diet that is biodiversity and climate friendly, what would that look like in the Nordic countries?
oh
And
yeah,
they found we produce basically 80% too much meat. So, and that's pretty consistent with other studies like the Eat Lancet work has found North Americans at least eat 6 times too much red meat for health and sustainability. So, we know that in terms of diet, there's a huge overconsumption of animal products, and that's also the case in Sweden and in the Nordic countries. So, what they did was kind of a backcasting approach where they said, okay, what we want is a food system that would be organic, low input. If we would only have what they called livestock on leftovers, so no
mm-hmm.
grain being fed to animals. The animals would only eat waste that humans can't eat, or be grazing in area, which obviously humans can't eat grass either. So you're getting away from that food feed competition,
Yeah,
and only grazing in places where it's beneficial for biodiversity. In Europe, this is something that's different. Here is that low intensity grasslands have the highest biodiversity. Those are the sort of
hmm.
key ecosystems to maintain and restore and preserve. And that's really important. I mean, Europe, like everywhere else, is experiencing a huge, screaming, plummeting loss of biodiversity, and it's an urgent priority to stabilize that and start to restore biodiversity. And to do that, maintaining and even potentially expanding these low intensity grasslands is a big priority.
Huh. And when you say low intensity, that's like low intensity grazing. Is that right? So you would
Right.
have just bring the animals through a little bit to like disrupt things and like create some ecological niches or whatever, soil compaction or those sorts of things.
Right. I heard it yesterday. Actually, it's good timing because all day yesterday I was at this webinar about the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. And one of the presentations there described it as a nitrogen transfer, basically, that
Okay.
these kind of grasslands have a lot of nitrogen fixing plants, and using that for grazing is kind of a way to make use of people eventually to make use of some of that nitrogen through the grazing and then through the manure that it generates and so on. So getting away from artificial inputs of like artificial
Right.
fertilizer.
Yeah, that's really interesting that those kind of low intensity grasslands have the highest biodiversity. And like, I'm from the Midwest originally, and our tall grass prairie ecosystems are like decimated in the US, right? It's like the most
Yeah.
endangered ecosystem. So yeah, it's really it's a really important system. So I guess that's a good segue into my next question, which is like, what are your perceptions about the biggest environmental challenges facing the EU's agricultural industry? So you're just mentioning like the intersection between agriculture and biodiversity and I guess land footprint, but um, what else, like with nitrogen and water pollution and other issues, are really important or are seen as really important in the EU?
So I think climate and biodiversity have really come up on the agenda, and Europe has now the European Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy. So those are in different ways supporting climate and biodiversity goals. So, for example, the European Commission has said with the new Common Agricultural Policy, 40% of the payments should be climate payments. We haven't seen any evidence that they will be, but that is the stated goal. So, I mean, it's recognized, and Europe has, aims to be a leader within the Sustainable Development Goals and including climate and biodiversity. So I think they're realizing, and they increasingly, that the farm to fork strategy is kind of one way of demonstrating they realize that agriculture is going to play this essential pivotal role. I mean, it really has to in meeting climate and biodiversity goals, because agriculture, as of course your students I'm sure have drilled into them by now, but I mean, it's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. It's the biggest use of land. It's the biggest use of water. It's about a quarter of land use in total, is about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions driving climate change. So it's basically fossil fuels and land use that are causing climate change. So, I mean, we just have to leave fossil fuels in the ground and switch to the ways that we use land and nature to be at least much less harmful and preferably regenerative, actually adding benefit to the land.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned the cap several times, and you'd like expand on that just a little bit about what all does that cover, and how I guess does it intersect with environment? I guess you just sort of hit on that with the climate payments, but what would those look like, and how does that differ from what's happened in the past?
Sure. So the cap, as I said, is this huge part of the European Union budget, and it dates back to a time after World War II where the main issue was food security and food production. And the goal was simply to increase production, and secondarily to ensure income for farmers, so that there would be, that it would be possible to have enough people growing food to feed the world, basically. This was the thinking. This is still the thinking behind the cap, or at least kind of baked into the design of the policy, even if it's now we really need to and should be recognizing this actually isn't the world that we live in anymore. So production is not the reason, a lack of production is not the reason that people don't have sufficient, healthy, and nutritious food. Our friend and colleague Emily Cassidy showed this, almost a decade ago, that we actually could feed 4 billion more people. And I think you were actually on that paper as well, probably. So
I wasn't,
credit where,
but
I'm
the biggest fan of the paper. So
okay, all right. Well, then hopefully your students have seen it. I always have.
They will see it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, coming up, a real treat, because
exactly
that paper shows, we could use current farmland to feed 4 billion more people, so almost 50% more people than exist today. So if we fed food directly to people rather than to animals, and so. Basically, we also did a study that came out last year that looked at 12,000 papers over the last 50 years that were about how to feed the world, basically. And what we found there is that this kind of production narrative or paradigm has really become dominant. So back in the 60s, around the time the cap was being developed, there was a lot of concern and writing about population, and it really was like seen as, okay, we need more people are arriving on planet Earth. We need more food to feed them. The thing to do is just use technology to increase yields, and that's how we'll address this problem. And I mean, technology in the Green Revolution was extremely successful at greatly increasing yields, but at the cost of a living planet, basically, as we see now. So, I mean, now we're at this point where we say, okay, we know how to produce food intensively and very high yield, but we aren't using the methods that work to produce enough food and feed people, but keep nature thriving, keep soils and water cycles and nutrient cycles healthy and intact, keep enough nature for biodiversity to thrive and to do its job and keep us healthy. So long story short, the cap is still kind of rooted in this productionist paradigm of just trying to focus on increasing production and yields. And so both the intensity of farming that's incentivized by the policies, and the just sort of pure focus on production, even if they've actually done a lot to try to get away from this because they recognize the problem. So there was, I think it was in the 80s, there were problems with overproduction because at that time, the payments from the policy were linked directly to production. So, you produce this many tons or liters of milk or whatever your crop is, and you get this much money. So there were, they said like mountains of butters and rivers or lakes of wine, like just, things that would go to waste because there was no market for them, but farmers would get paid for them because the more they produced, the more they got paid. So this was not the intention of the policy. So there have been a lot of reforms over the years, but where it's landed now is it's basically a policy that rewards landowners. So farmers get paid, or really landowners get paid. So it's not necessarily the people doing the farming, but whoever owns the land gets paid a certain price per hectare if they meet a few basic conditions. And that has led to the consolidation and expansion that I mentioned, because it's obviously more profitable to have larger holdings. So that's kind of the fundamental problem with the cap now, that about 3/4 of the money in total goes to direct income support payments to farmers. So not to meet any specific public benefit, but just to support the income of the activity of farming, or the landowner who's conducting farming. And what one of our studies last year showed is that the majority of that support goes to people who don't need it. So that income support is going to at least about 24 billion euros of it a year is going to farmers in areas where farm income is already at or above the median EU income. And it's actually not, so it's, further enriching pretty well off farmers. And it's actually not succeeding in what the goal of income support should be, which is to bring low income farmers up to a decent standard of living. So the payments, because those tend to be small farms, the payments are not enough to really increase their income.
That's super interesting. And the last time I took a agricultural policy class, which was many years ago at this point, but it was a similar situation in the US, where the majority of farmers that are receiving the payments are above the US median income, I think.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So if they transition to more of these climate-based payments, would that look like payments for doing practices that would sequester carbon? Is that the idea?
Yeah, so our basic suggestion, and this was definitely echoed by many of the speakers yesterday, is really two things. One, income support should be needs-based. So you should be low income to get income support to make you medium income. And if you're high income, you don't need more income support. So that's the first part. And that would free up a lot of the money. So for example, this 24 billion that we showed that is going as income support where it's not needed, the EU estimates that about 20 billion a year is needed to meet its biodiversity strategy for 2030. And right now it's a big question of, well, where is that money going to come from? Because that's a very substantial part of the budget. But, we're like, well, here's one place where it's, being misspent, that it could actually be redirected to meet the goals that you've said that you have. The climate part, so we found currently, or at least it was in 2015 that our data were from, but they were representative of the last period of the cap. So the cap happens in 7-year cycles. So right now there's a reform going on that will renew and change some of the rules and so on. So anyway, at least in the last cycle, we found it was only about 15% of the total cap budget that went to support low emission or high biodiversity farming. So basically environmentally friendly farming of some kind only got about 15% of the funding. And so our suggestion there, that others have also proposed, is basically public money should go to fund public goods. So if farmers should get rewarded and incentivized to take care of the land and produce the food that people need, and they're providing a lot of really valuable and essential, obviously, services. But I think thinking about that more holistically in terms of the stewardship aspects and habitat and water and carbon and the other things that are happening on land, and linking those environmental payments to results. So that's the second suggestion, is sort of decoupling, taking away the link between income payments and amount of land, and instead making the income payments based on need for income. And then secondly, making the environmental payments results based. So you mentioned measures earlier, and at the moment that's how they're incentivized. So, if you follow certain practices, or if you set aside 5% of your land as they're called environmental focus areas, or if they're kind of listed out if you do these things kind of from this checklist. But what we really want to encourage is to get beyond measures to actually, well, what works? Because sometimes you can apply measures in a silly way that doesn't make sense for your context or your farm, or if you have a buffer strip which is meant to catch runoff and it's perpendicular to the creek, it's doing absolutely nothing to catch the runoff, right? And I mean, there are some examples like this of following the letter but not the spirit of the law, and those might not be the majority. I mean, I don't think there's been a comprehensive analysis of how often does that happen, but the point is, there should be ways to actually measure the impact of the measures, and focus on the ones or the mix of ones that make the most sense and have the best results for a particular situation, and really focus on that. Right now it's more than there were 102 measures in the last CAP. So I think it's potentially quite overwhelming in terms of like, okay, if I'm a farmer, how do I pick from this opaque list that's quite hard to interpret and know what actually makes a difference?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's super interesting. Well, I guess just to wrap up, a lot of interesting like food for thought here about kind of where things or how things have evolved in the EU, and where it might be headed. But do you have any last thoughts on kind of like interesting trends that you're looking at, or that you've been seeing, and kind of where you think things are going in the next decade? Do you think that these reforms will have a chance at really being implemented? And are there any other sort of like farm level sort of trends that you've noticed too? Any last thoughts?
Sure. I think one thing I think is interesting is this trend toward more plant-based diets. And Oatly is a Swedish company that produces an oat drink or oat milk, and they've been quite successful. And they've also had some, critique. But I think something they did that was very interesting was sort of explicitly take on, big milk and like kind of be quite provocative in, for example, putting carbon footprints on their products and making the comparison to what cow-based milk is. And, they were like 10 times lower. I don't remember the exact number, but it's enormously lower. So I think that it's interesting to have more focus there. And at this meeting yesterday, there was a participant from Ireland who was saying, okay, in the new CAP, there's a lot of emphasis on member states, that the countries that make up the EU have a lot of responsibility to develop what are called their own strategic plans. So they should, and this is kind of where the action is now with the CAP, that I think at the EU level, there's maybe still some room to make a difference, but it's kind of in the point of the process where it's converging on an agreement. And so where things will really be important and interesting, I think, will be at this member state level. And that's maybe good news. I mean, it's not good news in the sense that I think the CAP that's under negotiation at the EU level should be much stronger and clearer, and be needs-based for income and results-based for environmental payments, and it's none of those things. So that's a really big problem. But on the other hand, it's probably easier to influence policy processes in your own country rather than, the further away you get from power, the harder it is for people to access it, I think. So it maybe is a good sign that, there's some room to engage in shaping these national plans to make them actually substantial and
Right.
beneficial. But that then requires civil society, engaged citizens, researchers. I mean, that takes a lot of in 27 member states, which takes a lot of work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like this massive framework, but then I guess room for customization or meeting the local priorities, which could be good and bad depending on how uh, how that actually gets executed. Yeah, that's super
Yeah.
interesting.
And I think, I mean, just to wrap up, like it's such a consistent takeaway for me how important the politics of it are, that this kind of 80/20 rule, which actually is borne out by the data in the cap, that it's a relatively small group of farmers that have a lot of benefit. And then you have, of course, I mean, political dynamics that lock in the current policies because they create a powerful interest group, and that interest group uses its power to reinforce the status quo, which benefits them. So, I mean, this is just like, power politics 101, but it explains a lot of carbon lock-in and, other unsustainable things. Why do we have the unsustainable systems that we have? There are many reasons, but one reason that might often get overlooked is, well, there are people who want it that way. So, figuring out through a combination of knowledge from science and pressure from civil society and eventually influencing politics to sort of reach a tipping point of overcoming vested interests, I think is really critical to actually seeing things, making change actually happen.
Yeah. Well, nice. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And it was really a pleasure to have you join us virtually. So I stop the recording there.
Thank you, Nathan.